The county recorder called me while I was standing in a hangar with a damaged helicopter behind me and 3 officers waiting for my answer. Colonel Mara Ellison, the woman said, someone tried to record a deed transferring part of your grandfather's land this morning. The signature on the deed belonged to my father. The property did not. Before I could ask who had filed it, my phone lit up with a second message. It was from Evelyn Shaw, the attorney who had managed my grandfather's trust for more than 30 years. The offer for the land had risen again. $52 million, she wrote. Do not discuss it with anyone until we speak. Then my new stepmother sent me a photograph from my father's kitchen. In the picture, she was smiling beside him while he held a blue folder against his chest. Her message said, your father has finally decided that family property should stay in the family. 3 facts reached me in less than 2 minutes. Someone had used my father's name to claim land he had never owned. That land was worth more money than anyone in my family understood. And the woman who had married my father 11 weeks earlier believed she had already won. I looked at the helicopter, at the officers, and at the open hangar doors beyond them. 27 years in the Army had taught me that panic was only useful to the person who caused it. I told the officers to continue the inspection without me. Then I walked into an empty briefing room, closed the door, and called the recorder back. Before I tell you how a forged deed, a secret commission, and 1 old pocket calendar brought my father's marriage down in open court, tell me where you are listening from tonight. I learned that people hear family stories differently depending on what they have survived themselves. My name is Mara Ellison. At the time this happened, I was 52 years old and serving as a colonel in Army aviation logistics. I did not fly combat missions anymore. My work was less dramatic and, in its own way, just as unforgiving. I was responsible for maintenance readiness, parts accountability, and the kind of records that decide whether aircraft return safely or remain grounded. A missing signature could stop an entire unit. A number entered in the wrong box could hide a failure until someone paid for it in the air. That is why I noticed details other people dismissed. I noticed when a date did not match a travel record. I noticed when a document had been scanned twice. I noticed when a person answered a question that had not been asked. Most of all, I understood chain of custody. Who touched a thing, when they touched it, what changed after they did. My father, Thomas Ellison, used to tease me about that. He said I could turn a grocery receipt into an investigation. He was 73 and had spent most of his working life as a railroad dispatcher in southern Missouri. His world had also been built on schedules, signals, and exact times. When I was a child, our kitchen wall held a calendar filled with his small square handwriting. Dentist appointments, oil changes, church suppers, the first tomato from the garden. He wrote down everything. After my mother died, he kept writing, but there was less life in the entries. Grocery store, pharmacy, mowed lawn, called Mara, no answer. That last one still hurts when I remember it. My career had taken me across the country and overseas. I called when I could. I came home for holidays when orders allowed. I sent birthday cards early because late mail had embarrassed me once, and I did not let the same mistake happen twice. Yet, there were long stretches when my father and I became 2 disciplined people reporting facts to each other instead of saying what we actually felt. My mother had been gone for 9 years when he met Celeste Vane. She was 46, polished, quick, and almost aggressively attentive. She had worked for years in title and escrow offices before opening what she called a senior financial transition service. According to her website, she helped older adults organize paperwork after retirement, divorce, or bereavement. According to Celeste, she had met my father when he attended a seminar at the community center about avoiding probate. According to my father, she had saved him from a life of frozen dinners and silence. I wanted that to be true. Their wedding took place in early May at a restored lodge outside Springfield. I arrived from Kentucky on the morning of the ceremony, changed into my dress uniform at a hotel, and drove through rain that turned the fields silver. My father stood near the fireplace greeting guests. He looked nervous and happy, which made him seem younger than he had in years. When he saw me, his whole face changed. "There is my girl," he said. He hugged me harder than usual. I felt ashamed of every call I had postponed because a report seemed urgent at the time. Then Celeste appeared beside him. She wore ivory silk and a smile that seemed to arrive 1 second before the rest of her expression. She took both my hands, studied the insignia on my uniform, and said she had heard so much about me. I said I hoped some of it was true. She laughed. My father laughed. The moment passed easily. But during the reception, Celeste found reasons to speak with me 4 times. The first time, she asked whether the Army provided housing for officers at my rank. I said I rented a small townhouse near Post. The second time, she asked whether I planned to retire soon and whether military retirement paid enough to live comfortably. I gave her a general answer. The third time, she asked about my grandfather's farm. That question was delivered casually. She was cutting cake and did not look at me when she asked it. Does anyone still use that old Ellison land near the river? She said. I set down my fork. My grandfather had never called it a farm. He called it the North Tract. It was more than 2,000 acres of forest, pasture, and rocky hills spread along a tributary of the Gasconade River. Our family had once grazed cattle there. By the time I was born, most of it had returned to woods. There were old service roads, 2 collapsed barns, and a stone house with no electricity where my grandfather sometimes took me to fish. I told Celeste the land was managed privately. She smiled and said, "Of course." The 4th time, she asked whether my father had ever told me how expensive aging could be. That was when I understood that her questions were not conversation, they were inventory. I watched her move through the room after that. She touched my father's shoulder whenever someone important approached. She remembered names after hearing them once. She asked an accountant where he practiced and a banker which branch he managed. She had the smooth curiosity of someone who knew that people gave away more information when they believed they were being admired. I did not dislike her because she was younger than my father. I did not distrust her because she wore expensive clothes or knew how to command attention. I had served with ambitious people all my life. Ambition could build hospitals, lead battalions, and carry families through disasters. What troubled me was the direction of her attention. During their vows, she looked at my father. During the reception, she looked at everything around him. After dinner, Evelyn Shaw arrived at the lodge. She was 78, narrow-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with white hair cut close around her face. She had been my grandfather Samuel's attorney since before I entered the Army. I had not seen her in almost 3 years. She asked me to walk outside. We stood beneath the covered porch while rain tapped the metal roof. Evelyn handed me a plain envelope. Inside was a valuation report and a letter of interest from a company called Meridian Strategic Materials. They wanted the North Tract. A geological survey conducted on neighboring land suggested that a ridge running through the trust property contained commercially valuable rare earth elements. Meridian wanted an exclusive option to conduct further testing, followed by the right to purchase or lease mineral rights. Their newest proposal valued the trust at approximately $52 million if testing confirmed what their models predicted. I read the number twice. My grandfather had built the trust slowly. Timber income, conservative investments, land bought during years when nobody wanted it. I had known the trust existed. I had not known its value had climbed so high. Evelyn watched me carefully. "Samuel made you the sole beneficiary," she said. "Your father was provided for separately through life insurance and retirement accounts. The trust does not belong to him. It never did." I asked why Meridian had approached now. She said land agents had been contacting owners across 3 counties. Rumors were spreading. Anyone who knew our family history might start asking questions. As she spoke, I looked through the lodge windows. Celeste was standing beside my father. She was not watching him. She was watching us. My grandfather had given me one rule about the trust. He told me never to let money introduce me before my character did. I had followed that rule for more than 2 decades. I drove a 12-year-old sport utility vehicle. I rented because I moved often. My furniture had survived 4 duty stations and 1 storage unit flood. I lived on my salary and never took a distribution from the trust. I folded the report, placed it back in the envelope, and told Evelyn to keep everything confidential. That decision did not feel brave. It felt ordinary. I had no idea it would become the first move in a fight Celeste had already begun planning. For the first month after the wedding, nothing happened that I could prove was wrong. Celeste replaced the living room furniture my mother had chosen. She donated my father's old dishes. She moved his railroad photographs from the hallway into boxes marked storage. My father told me the changes made the house feel new again. I tried to accept that. A home should belong to the living. My mother would have said the same thing. She had never worshipped furniture. She would have cared more that my father laughed again. Still, the reports came. Dottie Hale, my father's neighbor of nearly 30 years, called to ask whether Thomas had changed banks. A man had come to the house with papers, she said, and Celeste had told him they were moving everything into a modern wealth management system. My cousin Rebecca mentioned that Celeste had asked about the old Ellison acreage during a church picnic. My father's friend Earl said Celeste wanted to know whether Samuel Ellison had ever discussed mineral rights at the VFW hall. Each fact was small. Together they formed a pattern. I called my father one Sunday evening. He sounded cheerful. Celeste was making chicken and dumplings. They had spent the afternoon looking at lake cabins. I asked whether he had changed financial advisors. Celeste is helping me simplify things, he said. You know how scattered I have been since your mother died. My father was many things. Scattered was not one of them. I asked what had changed. He said his checking and savings accounts were now joint. Celeste had also helped him sign a durable financial power of attorney in case he became ill. He described it as ordinary planning. A durable power of attorney can be ordinary. It can also place enormous authority in the wrong hands. I told him to make sure his own lawyer reviewed every page. There was a pause. Celeste understands this work better than anyone, he said. This is what she does. I could hear defensiveness entering his voice. It was not anger yet. It was the first wall. I changed the subject. A week later, Evelyn called. Someone had requested copies of old deeds connected to the North Tract. Public property records were available to anyone, but the request was unusually broad. It included documents from before my grandfather created the trust. The request had been submitted by Grant Lasker, an attorney from St. Louis who handled contested estates and complex property litigation. Evelyn knew him by reputation. He is expensive, she said. He does not search records for curiosity. I asked whether he represented Celeste. She did not know. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I did what I would have done after discovering a discrepancy in a maintenance system. I protected the records. I asked Evelyn to verify every trust amendment, beneficiary designation, deed, survey, and tax payment. I requested certified copies from the county rather than relying on scans. I enrolled every trust parcel in the recorder's property fraud alert program, which sends notice when a document is filed under an owner's name. That alert would later save us weeks. At the time, it felt like fastening a seatbelt before a storm. My grandfather's trust documents were precise. He had created the trust 19 years earlier, when I was a major stationed in Germany. The trust owned the land, not me personally. I was the sole current beneficiary and successor trustee after Evelyn. My father had signed an acknowledgement at the time stating that he had no ownership interest in the North Tract and had received separate assets under my grandmother's estate plan. Evelyn found the acknowledgement in a fireproof cabinet. My father's signature was clear. The document had been witnessed by 2 people, notarized and referenced in later amendments. There was more. My grandfather had recorded a video statement during his final estate review. In it, he explained why he chose me. Mara does not confuse possession with purpose, he said. Thomas is my son, and I love him. I have provided for him in other ways. The land trust is for Mara because she will protect it from anyone who sees only the price. I had not watched the video since his funeral. Hearing his voice again brought back the smell of cedar shavings in his workshop and the way he tapped a pencil against his thumbnail when thinking. It also made me uneasy. My grandfather had not been a suspicious man. For him to speak so directly meant he had imagined a future challenge. Evelyn told me there was another protection. The trust required an independent appraisal and court notice before any sale of the core acreage. My grandfather had not wanted one beneficiary making a quick decision under pressure. That requirement would make Celeste's plan harder. It would not stop her from trying. During those weeks, my father began calling less. When I reached him, Celeste was often nearby. I could hear her voice suggesting answers. He is tired tonight. We are on our way out. We already handled that. The pronoun changed before the relationship did. My father stopped saying I and started saying we. Then he missed my mother's birthday remembrance at the cemetery. Every year, he and Dottie placed yellow roses at her grave. I usually called while they were there. That year, Dottie went alone. My father told her Celeste had scheduled a weekend trip and became upset when he suggested leaving early. I called him after Dottie told me. He sounded embarrassed. It was only 1 year, Mara. I... I said I understood. I did not understand. Celeste began reshaping the story of our family in ways that were difficult to challenge because each change was wrapped in concern. She told my father I was secretive because the army had made me emotionally distant. She said my questions about his finances were controlling. She suggested that I look down on their marriage because I had never married. When he repeated those ideas to me, he did not present them as hers. He presented them as thoughts he had recently developed. That was when the situation became personal. I could tolerate Celeste asking about money. I could tolerate lawyers searching deeds. What I could not ignore was the slow removal of my father's confidence in his own memories. I drove home on leave in late July. The house looked different before I entered. My mother's wind chimes were gone. The brass railroad sign that had hung beside the garage had been removed. A new security camera turned toward me as I walked up the path. Celeste answered the door. She said my father was resting. It was 2 in the afternoon. I stepped inside anyway. My father came from the kitchen wearing pressed slacks and a shirt I had never seen. He seemed glad to see me, but he looked toward Celeste before hugging me. That single glance told me more than any bank record could. We sat at the kitchen table. Celeste placed a blue folder near my father's elbow. I recognized it from the photograph she later sent me. At the time, I assumed it contained retirement papers. Celeste asked whether I remembered the North Tract boundaries. She said a company representative had approached them about a possible family opportunity. I asked, which company? She said she could not recall the name. People who forget a company name do not usually use the phrase family opportunity. My father cleared his throat. Celeste thinks your grandfather may have intended the land for all of us, he said. All of us meant my father, Celeste, and me. My grandfather had died before Celeste knew our family existed. I asked what evidence supported that belief. Celeste placed one hand over my father's. Families do not always put their true wishes on paper, she said. Sometimes one person ends up holding everything because it is convenient. I looked at my father. Do you believe Granddad made a mistake? I asked. He looked down at the table. I believe there may be enough for everyone, he said. That answer was not about fairness. It was about avoiding conflict with the woman holding his hand. I told them the trust was private and legally settled. Celeste smiled. Private things have a way of becoming public when family members are mistreated, she said. The threat was gentle enough for my father to pretend he had not heard it. I stood to leave. My father followed me to the porch. He apologized for the tension. Then he asked if I could just show Celeste the trust documents so she would stop worrying. I asked why she was worried about property that did not belong to her. He had no answer. Before I reached my vehicle, Celeste called after me. Mara, she said, your father deserves to know what his family is worth. I turned back. My father deserves peace, I said. Do not confuse that with permission. Her face changed for less than a second. The smile disappeared. The warmth left her eyes. What remained was not outrage. It was calculation. Then she smiled again and waved as I drove away. The property fraud alert arrived 11 days after my visit. I was in the hangar when the county recorder called. The document presented for recording was titled A Corrective Warranty Deed. It claimed that my father held an inherited half interest in a 600-acre portion of the North Tract and was transferring that supposed interest to a new limited liability company called TC Land Holdings. The company had been formed 9 days earlier. Its registered organizer was Celeste Ellison. The recorder had not rejected the deed because she knew our family. She had paused it because the legal description did not match the ownership history and because the trust was already listed as the record owner. She called Evelyn, whose contact information appeared in an earlier notice, and Evelyn told her to call me. I asked the recorder not to give me legal advice and not to alter normal procedures. I asked only for a certified copy of what had been submitted and the name of the person who brought it in. A courier had delivered it for Grant Lasker's office. My father's signature appeared on the last page. A notary certificate stated that he had personally appeared before a notary on the previous Thursday at 10:30 in the morning. I knew where my father had been at 10:30 that morning. He had called me from the Veterans Clinic after an appointment. I remembered because he complained about the coffee and because the clinic was nearly 90 miles from the notary's listed office, memory was not proof. My father, however, kept proof without realizing it. He still carried the small black pocket calendar the railroad had given retirees every January. He wrote down departure times, arrival times, mileage, and names. He had done it for decades. Celeste thought the habit was old-fashioned. I thought it might be the first clean break in her story. I called my father. He answered on the fourth ring. I asked whether he had signed a deed the previous Thursday. Silence. Then I heard Celeste in the background. Tell her we already discussed the family property. My father said he had signed some planning papers, but he did not remember a deed. I asked whether a notary had been present. Another silence. Celeste took the phone. Mara, she said, your father does not need to be interrogated. I said I was asking one question about a document carrying his signature. She said everything had been handled legally. I asked her to put my father back on the phone. She ended the call. That was the moment I stopped treating the matter as a possible misunderstanding. I contacted Evelyn and asked her to retain 3 people: a property litigator, a forensic document examiner, and an accountant experienced in tracing elder financial exploitation. Evelyn chose Daniel Cho for the litigation. He was 61, patient, and almost painfully exact. He had spent years representing banks before leaving corporate practice to handle trust disputes. During our first meeting, he placed the attempted deed on the table and pointed to the notary block. A notary confirms the identity and acknowledgement of the signer, Daniel said. A notary does not create ownership where none exists. Even if your father signed this knowingly, he could only transfer an interest he actually owned. The records show he owned none. That was the first legal fact that steadied me. The deed could create confusion. It could trigger expensive litigation. It could be used to pressure a buyer or cloud title. But it could not magically give my father land the trust had owned for years. The second fact was less comforting. Daniel explained that Celeste did not need to win a final judgment to profit. If she could create enough uncertainty around title, Meridian might pay the family to settle the dispute or might negotiate through her company simply to clear the path. Pressure, not ownership, might be the real product. We searched public records connected to TC Land Holdings. The company address matched a private mailbox in Springfield. Its operating agreement was not public. Its name likely stood for Thomas and Celeste. Evelyn requested that the recorder hold the filing for statutory review and then filed a notice disputing the claimed interest. Daniel prepared an emergency petition asking the court to confirm the trust's title and prevent further transfers while the issue was investigated. I drove to Missouri the next day. My father did not answer the door. Celeste did. She stood behind the storm door and said he was sleeping. I told her I needed to speak with him alone. She refused. I told her a deed bearing his signature had been filed. She said her attorney would respond. I asked whether my father knew that her new company would receive the property. Her expression tightened. You always think rank gives you authority everywhere, she said. I told her rank had nothing to do with it. Then why are you standing on my porch giving orders? Because my father's name is on a document he does not remember signing. She opened the door just enough to step outside and pulled it shut behind her. Her voice dropped. Your father is not helpless, Mara. He made a choice. He is tired of being treated like a poor relation while you sit on land worth a fortune. The phrase poor relation did not sound like my father. He had a pension, savings, a paid house, and no debt before the wedding. I asked how she knew what the land was worth. She smiled. People talk. I asked whether Meridian Strategic Materials had talked to her. The smile remained, but her eyes changed. That was the first time I knew the company was connected to her. She recovered quickly. I have no idea what you mean, she said. I told her we would let the records answer. As I turned away, my father appeared behind the front window. He lifted one hand, but did not open the door. I drove to Dottie's house across the street. Dottie was 76, retired from teaching English, and still kept a bowl of peppermints by the door. She poured coffee and told me what she had seen. Celeste had begun screening my father's calls. She had discouraged his friends from visiting because she said he tired easily. She had taken him to a new bank in Springfield twice. A man in a dark sedan had visited 3 evenings in 1 week. Dottie had also seen my father sitting alone on the back steps after midnight. I asked whether she thought he was confused. No, she said. I think he is ashamed. Shame makes people hide facts they understand perfectly. That sentence stayed with me. I did not want to turn my father into a helpless victim simply because he had made bad choices. He was competent. He was also lonely, pressured, and increasingly isolated. Both things could be true. Daniel obtained a court order preserving records related to the attempted transfer. That allowed us to send formal requests to Grant Lasker, the notary, TC Land Holdings, and several financial institutions. Grant responded first. He denied wrongdoing. He said his office had relied on representations from Celeste and Thomas, that the land had been improperly placed in trust without honoring an oral family agreement. He claimed the deed was intended to memorialize my father's equitable interest. Daniel read the letter twice. An oral story does not defeat a recorded chain of title merely because someone repeats it in legal language, he said. The notary's response was stranger. Her journal showed that Thomas Ellison had appeared at 10:30 that Thursday. A copy of his driver's license was attached. The signature in the journal looked like my father's, but the notary's office security system showed no visitor entry under his name. The building's parking log showed Celeste's vehicle arriving at 10:12 and leaving at 10:47. My father's vehicle did not appear. The Veterans Clinic confirmed that he had checked in at 9:51, completed lab work at 10:28, and paid for lunch at the clinic cafeteria at 11:13. The clinic was more than an hour away. Someone had brought the notary a copy of his identification and a signature. Whether the notary had been careless or involved remained unclear. Then the accountant found the first money trail. Celeste had opened TC Land Holdings with a deposit of $25,000. The funds came from a consulting company called ClearPath Senior Transitions, which she owned. ClearPath had received the same amount 3 days earlier from Meridian Strategic Materials. The payment was labeled Preliminary Land Assembly Consulting. Meridian had paid Celeste before the deed was filed. When Daniel told me, I felt the same cold quiet that had settled over me in difficult command investigations. Celeste was not merely fighting for my father. She had been hired to deliver something. The remaining question was how much she expected to earn if she succeeded. We learned the amount 1 week later. Meridian had not volunteered its agreement with Celeste. Daniel obtained it only after the court ordered all parties to preserve and produce communications concerning the North Tract. The document was called a Land Assembly Advisory Contract. Its language was polished. Its purpose was simple. If Celeste secured signatures, releases, or settlements sufficient to remove family objections to Meridian's option, she would receive a success fee equal to 3% of the final transaction value. 3% of $52 million was more than $1.5 million. There was also a second payment. If she delivered an enforceable option within 90 days, she would receive an additional $250,000. Her deadline was approaching. That explained the speed. It also explained why she had married my father after knowing him less than a year, why she had asked about the land at the wedding, why she had replaced his advisors, and why she had pushed a deed through, even though the title records contradicted it. The plan was not elegant. It did not need to be. Celeste needed to create a family claimant. My father was the last living child of the man who had created the trust. If she could place a supposed interest in a company she controlled, she could demand a seat at the table. If the claim failed eventually, she still hoped the threat of delay would force me or Meridian to pay her to disappear. The accountant found another pressure point. Celeste owed $684,000 under a civil judgment connected to her former title company. Years earlier, client funds had gone missing during a failed real estate development. Celeste had not been criminally charged. She had signed a settlement denying intentional misconduct while agreeing to repay a large amount. The judgment had been renewed. Interest was accumulating. Her new life with my father had not rescued her from debt. The Meridian contract could. Daniel warned me not to let the debt turn our case into a morality play. We prove conduct, he said. We do not ask the court to punish her for needing money. Needing money is not fraud. Filing false documents and manipulating a vulnerable relationship may be. That distinction mattered. I did not want revenge disguised as justice. I wanted the title cleared, my father's assets protected, and the truth established with records no one could explain away. Celeste made the next move before we could file our amended petition. She came to my townhouse on a Saturday morning with Grant Lasker. I had just returned from a run. My hair was still damp, and a pot of oatmeal sat cooling on the stove. They stood on my porch as though they had scheduled an appointment. Grant carried a leather case. Celeste carried the blue folder. I had installed a doorbell camera after the deed filing. They could see it above them. I could see that they saw it. That was useful. I opened the door, but did not invite them in. Grant said they wanted to resolve the dispute privately. I asked whether my father was with them. Celeste said he had authorized her to speak. I asked for the authorization. She lifted the blue folder. I told her to hand it to Daniel. Her smile sharpened. Must everything pass through a lawyer now, Mara? Once someone files a deed, using my father's name, yes. Grant stepped forward slightly. Colonel Ellison, he said, litigation will expose private matters. Your financial position, your trust, your relationship with your father. There are ways to avoid unnecessary damage. I asked what they wanted. He said Celeste's company would release its claimed interest if the trust paid $800,000 and granted her a consulting role in any future negotiation with Meridian. The demand was almost exactly enough to satisfy the principle of her civil judgment and leave money for taxes and fees. I asked whether my father knew she was requesting payment to her company. Celeste answered before Grant could. This is for Thomas. Everything I do is for Thomas. I asked why the money would not go to Thomas. For the first time, Grant looked at her rather than me. Celeste's face flushed. You always twist things, she said. You come home in that uniform and act like everyone else is under inspection. I was wearing running clothes. I said nothing. Silence made her continue. Your father should have inherited that land, she said. He was Samuel's son. You were a child who left. You built a life somewhere else. Thomas stayed. Thomas cared for his parents. Then you return for ceremonies and expect everyone to accept that you own everything. There was truth mixed into the accusation. My father had stayed. He had driven my grandparents to appointments. He had repaired the house and managed storms, and sat beside my grandfather during his final hospital stay while I was deployed. My grandfather had still made the trust decision deliberately. Both facts could be true. I told Celeste that if my father believed he had been treated unfairly, I would speak with him directly and listen. I would not pay her company for a claim created after Meridian hired her. Grant's eyes narrowed. That is a serious allegation. It is supported by the contract your client produced under court order. Celeste turned toward him. You said that was confidential. Grant looked as though he wanted the porch to open beneath him. I continued. Your preliminary fee came from Meridian. Your company was formed after the contract. The deed transferred the supposed interest to your company, not to my father. Now you want trust money paid to the same company. This is not difficult to understand. Celeste's control finally broke. You think because you have records you know everything, she said. Records are a good place to start. She raised the blue folder. Your father signed every document in here. Then he should have no trouble explaining them under oath. The color left her face. Grant closed his case without opening it. He said they would proceed through counsel. I told him that was what I had requested from the beginning. As they walked toward their car, Celeste turned back. If you force Thomas into court, he will never forgive you. I looked at her. If he has been told the truth, he will not need to forgive me. They left. My hands began shaking only after I closed the door. People sometimes imagine military discipline means fear disappears. It does not. Discipline means fear does not get to choose your next action. I turned off the stove, wrote down everything that had been said, saved the camera recording, and sent both to Daniel. 3 days later, Celeste and my father filed a civil claim against the trust. My father's name appeared first. The complaint alleged that my grandfather had promised the North Tract would benefit his descendants equally. It accused me of using my position as successor trustee to conceal information and deprive my father of support in old age. It asked the court to impose a constructive trust over half the property and recognize TC Land Holdings as the proper recipient of my father's interest. Reading my father's name on the first page hurt more than the allegations. I called him. Celeste answered. I asked to speak with my father. She said all communication should go through counsel. I said, put him on the phone. Her voice became cold. He does not want to speak to you. In the background, I heard a chair move. Then my father said my name, Mara. Celeste lowered her voice, but I could still hear her. Thomas, your attorney said not to discuss the case. My father came closer to the phone. I only want what Dad meant for me to have, he said. I asked whether he had read the complaint. Celeste interrupted. The call ended. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, with the phone in my hand. Then I did something I had avoided since the wedding. I allowed myself to be angry. Not loud anger, not the kind that breaks objects or sends messages at midnight, the useful kind. I opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote 4 questions. What did my father knowingly sign? What did Celeste tell him? What did Meridian expect her to deliver? Who changed the documents after my father's signature? Below those questions, I drew a line. On one side, I wrote facts. On the other, I wrote assumptions. It was a habit from command investigations. Assumptions feel like facts when emotion repeats them often enough. Writing them apart keeps you honest. The lawsuit became public the next morning. A local reporter called. A veterans group asked whether the allegation could affect an award I was scheduled to receive. Someone posted online that an Army colonel was hoarding family land while her elderly father struggled. My father was not struggling financially. The story did not require truth to travel. At headquarters, my commanding general asked to see me. He did not accuse me of anything. He said family litigation involving large assets could create security concerns and public distractions. He asked whether I needed leave. I told him I could perform my duties. He studied me for a moment, then perform them, he said, and document everything. It was the most military advice possible. It was also exactly what I needed. Discovery began in September. Lawyers use that word for the formal exchange of information before trial. It sounds clean. In practice, it means boxes of records, sworn answers, depositions, objections, delays, and the slow exposure of choices people expected to remain private. Daniel approached it the way I approached an aircraft readiness review. He built a timeline. Every event received a date, a source, and a confidence level. Bank visits, emails, phone calls, document drafts, notary entries, Meridian payments, my father's medical appointments, Celeste's debt deadlines, grants filings. I used colored index cards on the wall of Evelyn's conference room, blue for my father, red for Celeste, green for Meridian, white for public records. Daniel joked that the Army had invaded his office. I told him the Army used larger walls. The first important break came from document metadata. Grant's office produced 3 versions of the corrective deed. The earliest draft named Thomas Ellison as the recipient of the claimed interest. The second draft transferred the interest from Thomas to TC Land Holdings. The third combined both steps into one document, making it appear that my father already possessed the interest and was immediately assigning it to Celeste's company. The file history showed that Celeste had edited the second draft on her personal computer. Her comment in the margin said, "Need control an entity before Meridian sees title." Grant claimed he had not noticed the comment before production. Daniel said nothing for several seconds after reading it. Then he said, "That sentence may be the most expensive one she ever wrote." The second break came from my father's bank. Under the power of attorney, Celeste had transferred $140,000 from his savings into a joint investment account. From that account, $40,000 went to ClearPath Senior Transitions as a planning fee. My father had never paid a planning fee of that size in his life. The invoice described services including estate coordination, property strategy, and family claim development. Celeste had used my father's money to finance the claim filed in his name. The third break came from Meridian. The company had initially resisted producing internal emails. When the judge ordered them to comply, we received a chain between Celeste and a regional acquisition director named Warren Bell. In the first email, Celeste wrote that she had married into the controlling family and could deliver the remaining signature problem. There was no remaining signature problem. The trust owned the land. In another email, Warren asked whether the daughter would cooperate. Celeste replied that military people respond to pressure, hierarchy, and public embarrassment. She said I would settle before allowing a family dispute to damage my career. She had mistaken discipline for fear of appearances. Near the end of the chain, Warren warned that Meridian would not pay a success fee if title had to be cleared through prolonged litigation. Celeste replied, "I will have Thomas sign whatever is necessary before the quarter closes." Daniel read that line aloud. Then he looked at me. "Your father needs independent counsel," he said. I agreed. The difficulty was reaching him. Celeste controlled his mail and calls. The lawsuit listed Grant as counsel for both Celeste and my father, even though their interests were not the same. Daniel filed a motion asking the court to inquire into the conflict and ensure my father understood his position. The judge scheduled a private status conference. Celeste objected. The judge ordered my father to appear. He arrived wearing a gray suit and carrying his black pocket calendar. Celeste sat beside him in the hallway. Grant stood over both of them, speaking quietly. When my father saw me, he looked away. Inside the courtroom, Judge Miriam Holt asked Celeste and Grant to remain outside while she spoke with my father. Daniel and I also stepped out. The conversation was sealed, so I never learned every word. What I know is that my father emerged 40 minutes later with a different lawyer. Her name was Renee Alvarez. She had been called from a list of attorneys available to advise older litigants with potential conflicts. She was 59, direct, and warm without being soft. Her first expert sentence to my father, which he later repeated to me, was this: "A person can love his spouse and still need a lawyer whose only duty is to him." Within 2 days, my father withdrew Grant's authority to represent him. He did not withdraw from the lawsuit immediately. That hurt, but it also told me he was beginning to separate his own choices from Celeste's pressure. Renee reviewed every document with him. She discovered that my father believed the blue folder contained a family mediation request, a general property history, and forms allowing Celeste to gather records. He admitted signing several pages without reading them because Celeste placed adhesive tabs where his signature belonged. He remembered signing a page at home on the morning of his Veterans Clinic appointment. He did not remember appearing before a notary. His pocket calendar confirmed the day in exact detail. Left home 7:40, picked up Earl 8:10, clinic check in 9:50, lab 10:20, lunch 11:10, home 1:35, rain after 3. The entry had been written in the same pencil he used every day. The clinic records and Earl's statement matched it. Renee asked whether Celeste had access to his driver's license. She kept both their identification cards in a document pouch. She also knew his online banking password. My father looked ill when he understood what those answers meant. Then Renee found a small envelope tucked inside the blue folder. It contained a copy of the Meridian Advisory contract with the compensation page removed. Celeste had shown my father enough of the agreement to say she was helping negotiate a family opportunity. She had hidden the page, revealing her success fee. My father asked Renee to arrange a meeting with me. We met at Evelyn's office after business hours. He entered slowly, holding his calendar and the blue folder. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I signed papers I did not understand." I asked whether he had signed the complaint knowingly. He nodded. "Celeste told me Samuel had cheated me," he said. "She said you knew the land was worth a fortune and had hidden it because you thought I was irresponsible. She said the only way to make you tell the truth was to file before Meridian bought anything." I asked whether he believed her. "I wanted to," he said. That answer was honest enough to hurt. He continued, "I was angry that Dad left you the land. I had never said it out loud. I told myself I was not angry because he had provided for me in other ways." Then Celeste gave the anger a story. She said I had been the son who stayed while you were the granddaughter who left. She made it sound like the trust was proof that Dad valued your service more than my care. I looked at my father across the table. "Granddad did value what you did," I said. "He told me that. The trust was not a verdict on your life." My father pressed both hands against the calendar. "I should have asked you." "Yes," I said. The word landed hard. I did not soften it. He looked at the floor. I asked why he had allowed Celeste to cut off our calls. He said every conversation ended in an argument after he hung up. Celeste told him I was gathering evidence to declare him incompetent. She said if he spoke to me privately, I would use his words in court. I had never considered declaring him incompetent. The lie was effective because it matched his deepest fear. Not poverty, not loneliness, loss of control. Celeste understood older clients. She knew which fear opened which door. My father slid the blue folder toward me. "There is something else," he said. Inside was a printed email Celeste had left in their home printer. It was from Warren Bell at Meridian. The email stated that Celeste's full success fee would be wired within 5 business days after delivery of a signed settlement or transferable option. It also said Meridian would reimburse up to $100,000 in litigation expenses if she maintained a credible family claim. My father had found it that morning. On the bottom, Celeste had written a note in blue ink. Get Tom to reaffirm before hearing. Do not mention fee. The room became very quiet. My father looked at me. I withdrew from the claim this afternoon, he said. Renee filed it. I felt relief, but not triumph. The lawsuit had carried his name. The withdrawal could not erase that. He asked whether I could forgive him. I told him the truth. I do not know yet. He nodded. That answer hurt him. It was still kinder than a promise I did not trust myself to keep. Before he left, he placed the pocket calendar on the table. You may need this, he said. I pushed it back. You will need it more. It is your memory. Bring it to court. He closed his hand around it. For the first time since the wedding, he looked like the father I remembered. Not because he was agreeing with me, because he was willing to face what he had done. The hearing was set for the second week of November. By then, the original dispute had changed shape. My father had withdrawn his claim and disavowed the deed. The trust asked the court to declare title clear, cancel any recorded or pending instrument based on the false interest, and order Celeste and TC Land Holdings to pay the costs caused by their actions. Daniel also asked for sanctions against Grant if the evidence showed he had filed claims without a reasonable factual basis. Celeste responded by accusing my father of being manipulated by me. She claimed he had changed his position only after I threatened to cut him off from the trust. There was no evidence because no threat had occurred. Still, the accusation served a purpose. It gave her a new story after the first one collapsed. I returned to Missouri 2 days before the hearing. My father was staying with Earl. He had filed for a legal separation and revoked Celeste's power of attorney. Renee had helped him freeze the joint investment account while the disputed transfers were reviewed. He looked exhausted. We ate dinner at a small diner near the highway. He ordered meatloaf and barely touched it. He asked whether I planned to testify. I said yes. He asked whether Daniel would show the Meridian emails. I said yes. He stared at his plate. People will know what a fool I was, he said. I told him people would know he had been deceived and had also ignored warnings. He looked up. That is not very comforting. It is not supposed to be, I said. Comfort is what Celeste used to keep you from asking questions. Truth should do better than comfort. He considered that, then nodded. My father had always respected direct language. I had forgotten that because I was afraid directness would drive him further away. Celeste had filled the space created by our caution. The courthouse stood in the center of town, a square stone building with worn steps and an elevator that moved slowly enough to make strangers speak to each other. I wore a dark civilian suit. My uniform had nothing to prove in that room. Celeste arrived with Grant and 2 assistants. She wore navy blue and carried herself as though the hearing were a business meeting she expected to control. My father entered with Renee. Celeste turned toward him. Thomas, she said. He stopped but did not approach. You lied about the fee, he said. Grant touched Celeste's arm and told her not to respond. She looked at my father as if he had betrayed her. That expression told me she still believed his independence belonged to her. Judge Holt began with the title, History. Daniel introduced the original deed conveying the North Tract into trust, the later surveys, tax records, and my father's written acknowledgement that he held no ownership interest. He showed the court each trust amendment. Every amendment reaffirmed the same beneficiary and the same limits on sale. Then Evelyn testified. She spoke about my grandfather's estate planning meetings, his mental capacity, his independent counsel, and his reasons for separating my father's inheritance from the land trust. Grant suggested that Samuel may have pressured my father to sign the acknowledgement. Evelyn looked over her glasses. Thomas was 54 years old, employed, represented by his own attorney, and fully capable of disagreeing with his father, she said. Samuel could not pressure that man into choosing a restaurant. A few people in the gallery laughed. My father did not. Then Daniel played my grandfather's video. The screen showed Samuel seated in Evelyn's old conference room. His hands were folded over the head of a wooden cane. His voice was weaker than I remembered, but his eyes were clear. He said he loved his son. He said Thomas had received the house, insurance, investments, and retirement support. He said the North Tract would go to me because I had promised to preserve its purpose, and because I had never asked him to turn it into cash. Then he said something I had forgotten. If Mara is ever pressured to sell, look first at who profits from the urgency. The sentence seemed to settle over the courtroom. Daniel turned next to Celeste's Meridian contract. Grant objected that the agreement was irrelevant to the validity of the trust. Judge Holt overruled him. Motive is relevant when a party creates a supposed ownership interest and then asks the court to honor it, she said. Daniel displayed the compensation page. He explained the preliminary payment, the success fee, the deadline, and the bonus for delivering an option within 90 days. Celeste sat very still. The first layer was now clear. She had not discovered a family injustice, and then contacted Meridian. Meridian had paid her, and then she created the family claim. Daniel called Warren Bell. Warren had negotiated dozens of land agreements for Meridian. He admitted hiring Celeste because she represented that her husband controlled an unresolved family interest. He admitted the company had not independently verified that claim before paying her. Daniel asked whether Meridian instructed Celeste to forge a deed. Warren said no. He asked whether Meridian instructed her to conceal the success fee from my father. Warren said no. He asked whether Meridian would have hired her if the company knew the trust records showed my father had no interest. Warren said no. The second layer was responsibility. Meridian had encouraged speed and funded pressure, but Celeste had supplied the false premise. Then the forensic document examiner testified. She had compared my father's known signatures with the signature on the corrective deed. Her conclusion was careful. The signature likely began with a genuine source. Several strokes matched an earlier signature from a bank authorization with unusual precision. Too much precision. Natural signatures vary. The deed signature aligned with the bank signature so closely that the examiner believed it had been digitally lifted and placed into the deed before printing. Grant objected. The examiner explained the image artifacts, repeated edge patterns, and differences in ink density. The deed signature was not written on the paper. It was printed as part of the page. The notary had certified an acknowledgement that had not occurred. The notary, now represented by her own lawyer, invoked her right not to answer questions that might expose her to criminal liability. The courtroom changed after that. Until then, Celeste could describe the dispute as aggressive family lawyering. A copied signature and false acknowledgement were something else. My father held his pocket calendar with both hands. Renee called him to testify. He stated his name, age, and work history. He explained his habit of recording appointments. He read the entry for the day of the supposed notarization. Clinic records and Earl's testimony confirmed every important time. Renee asked whether he had authorized Celeste to place his signature on the deed. No, he said. She asked whether he had known the deed transferred a claimed interest to her company. No. She asked whether he had known about the success fee. No. Then Grant cross-examined him. He suggested my father was changing his story to repair his relationship with me. My father looked at me before answering. I am trying to repair my relationship with my daughter, he said. That does not change where I was on Thursday morning. Grant asked whether he had believed he deserved part of the land. My father said yes. Grant seemed relieved. Then my father continued. Believing I deserved something did not make it mine. Being angry did not give my wife permission to use my name. That was the third layer. My father had not been innocent of resentment. He was innocent of the deed fraud. The distinction made his testimony stronger, not weaker. At the afternoon break, Celeste approached him in the hallway. She said, Tom, please. You know why I did this. He looked at her for a long moment. I know why you told me you did it, he said. That is not the same thing. She reached for his hand. He stepped back. The bailiff called us into the courtroom. I thought the worst had already been exposed. I was wrong. The final exhibit came from a backup server. Meridian had produced current emails, but a technician later discovered archived messages connected to an employee account Warren Bell had used before the project received its formal code name. The archive contained a message sent almost 7 months before my father's wedding. Celeste had written it. The subject line referred to family access. In the message, she told Warren that she had identified the surviving son of Samuel Ellison through property and probate records. She described Thomas as a widower, retired, locally respected, and disconnected from the granddaughter who controlled the trust. She said she could create a relationship through an estate planning seminar and determine whether he could be persuaded to challenge the land arrangement. She had not met my father by chance. She had found him. The next email was sent 3 days after their first coffee together. Celeste wrote that Thomas was lonely, proud of his daughter's service, and quietly hurt by his father's estate plan. She called that combination workable. My father made a sound beside me. Not a word, just breath leaving a body after impact. Daniel asked Warren whether he had read the messages at the time. Warren said yes. Daniel asked whether Meridian had approved Celeste's personal relationship with my father as an acquisition strategy. Warren said the company had never instructed her to marry anyone. That was not the question. Judge Holt repeated it. Warren admitted that he understood Celeste was developing personal access to a landowner's family and did not stop her. The fourth layer was the one none of us had expected. The marriage itself had begun as part of the land strategy. Celeste's lawyer asked for a recess. Judge Holt denied it. Daniel introduced one more email. It had been written by Celeste 2 weeks before the wedding. Once I am family, she wrote, Mara cannot shut me out without looking cruel. Thomas will sign if he thinks he is finally correcting his father's insult. I looked at my father. His face had gone gray. Everything he thought had rescued him from loneliness had been built around a transaction. Celeste stood suddenly. That is not what happened, she said. Judge Holt ordered her to sit. Celeste remained standing. She looked at my father, not the judge. I loved you, she said. Whatever this started as, I loved you. My father did not answer. Grant pulled at her sleeve. She sat. Judge Holt warned that another interruption would result in removal. The hearing continued. But the legal dispute had already become something larger. It was no longer only about forged title, hidden fees, or bad faith litigation. It was about how carefully a person can study another human being and still see only leverage. Before I tell you what my father said when he finally faced her, I want you to do one thing. If you have ever had to admit that someone you trusted used your loneliness, leave a simple word in the comments. Still here. That is enough. And stay with this story because the next choice mattered more to me than the money or the ruling. Daniel called me to testify. I explained the trust, my conversations with my grandfather, and my decision not to disclose its value. I explained that I had never threatened to withhold money from my father and had never taken a personal distribution. Grant asked whether I considered myself more responsible than my father. No, I said. He asked why Samuel trusted me with the land. Because he asked what I would do if it became valuable, I said. I told him value did not create obligation to sell. Grant asked whether I now intended to sell to Meridian. No. That answer surprised the room. Meridian's offer remained open. $52 million was only an estimate, and future testing could increase it. Yet by then, I had seen what urgency around the land had done. My grandfather's trust did not require me to reject every sale. It required me to protect purpose before price. I testified that I had begun discussing a conservation agreement and a limited lease for road access that could fund a veteran recovery center without surrendering the core acreage or mineral rights. And Grant stared at me. So you would deny your father millions and give the land to strangers. My father spoke from behind him. She is not denying me anything. Judge Holt looked toward him. My father asked permission to speak through his lawyer. Renee stood. With the court's permission, Thomas would like to clarify his position. Judge Holt allowed it. My father returned to the witness chair. He looked first at the judge. Then he looked at Celeste. My father said he had withdrawn every claim to the trust. He acknowledged that his father had provided generously for him and that resentment had made him vulnerable to a story he wanted to believe. Then he said, I do not want $1 from that land. Celeste shook her head. Thomas, do not do this, he continued. I thought being chosen by you proved I still had a life ahead of me. Now I know I was selected from a record search. But what I did after that was still my responsibility. Mara warned me. My friends warned me. I chose the answer that protected my pride. He opened the black pocket calendar. On the day he met Celeste at the seminar, he had written one line, met Celeste. First good conversation in months. He tore the page out carefully. For a moment, I thought he would destroy it. Instead, he folded it and placed it in his jacket pocket. This happened, he said. I will not pretend it did not, but it does not get to decide what I do next. Celeste began to cry. I do not know whether the tears were grief, fear, or both. People are rarely only one thing. She may have developed real affection for my father after approaching him for money. That possibility did not erase what she had done. Judge Holt recessed for 45 minutes. No one spoke in the hallway. My father sat beside me on a wooden bench. Our shoulders nearly touched. After several minutes, he said, "Your grandfather was right about the land." I asked which part. The part about looking at who profits from urgency? I told him Samuel had been right about many things and unbearable about half of them. My father laughed once. It was the first honest laugh I had heard from him in months. When court resumed, Judge Holt read her findings slowly. The trust held clear title. Thomas had no legal or equitable ownership interest. The corrective deed was void and would be canceled from the record. TC Land Holdings had no claim. Celeste had acted for personal financial benefit while concealing her compensation and using Thomas's identity and purported interest to create leverage. The court found the litigation had been pursued in bad faith. Judge Holt ordered Celeste and her company to pay the trust's reasonable legal fees and costs. She ordered repayment of the funds transferred from my father's accounts, subject to final accounting. She referred the false notarization and document evidence to the county prosecutor and referred Grant's conduct to the state disciplinary authority. The judge also issued an order preventing Celeste from transferring or encumbering my father's assets while their domestic case proceeded. Then she addressed Meridian. The company had not forged the deed, but its employees had financed a strategy they knew depended on personal manipulation and an unverified family claim. The judge ordered the relevant records preserved for any separate civil action. Celeste did not look at me when the ruling ended. She looked at my father. "Was any of it real?" he asked her. Her answer came quietly. "Some of it became real." My father closed his eyes. That may have been the cruelest, truthful sentence spoken all day. He opened them again. "It became real too late," he said. Then he stood and walked out with me. The legal ending came faster than the personal one. Celeste moved out of my father's house under a temporary agreement. Their separation became a divorce by spring. She sold her consulting business and used the proceeds, along with funds recovered from other accounts, to satisfy part of what she owed my father and the trust. The investigation into the false deed continued beyond the civil hearing. Grant resigned from representing her and later received professional discipline for filing claims after evidence contradicted the factual basis he had presented. Meridian withdrew its offer. The company said market conditions had changed. Daniel said companies often discover changing market conditions shortly after their internal emails are read in court. My father returned home to rooms Celeste had redesigned and photographs she had packed away. For several weeks, he slept in the guest room because the bedroom felt like evidence. I visited on weekends when duty allowed. At first, our conversations were practical. Change the locks, close the joint account, call the insurance company, restore the old telephone number, return Dottie's casserole dish. Practical work is useful after betrayal. It gives the hands something to do while the heart catches up. We found my mother's wind chimes in a storage unit. We found the brass railroad sign under a stack of decorative mirrors. We found boxes of photographs Celeste had labeled obsolete family items. My father held that label for a long time. Then he laughed, though his eyes filled. "Your mother would have had something to say about this," he said. "She would have said it loudly," I replied. We hung the railroad sign beside the garage. We placed the wind chimes on the porch. Their sound was thin at first, because one metal tube had bent. My father straightened it with pliers. Trust did not return all at once. I did not suddenly call him every night. He did not stop feeling ashamed because a judge ruled in our favor. Some Sundays, we ate dinner and barely spoke. Some conversations ended with one of us irritated. Healing was not a speech. It was repetition. Call when you say you will. Tell the truth before it becomes convenient. Ask the question that might create conflict. Listen to the answer without preparing a defense. Those habits repaired us. In January, Evelyn asked me to meet her at the North Tract. Snow lay in the shaded parts of the road. The stone house looked smaller than it had when I was a child. My father came with us, carrying the same black pocket calendar. Evelyn brought a metal document box from her car. She said my grandfather had instructed her to open it only if the trust survived a serious challenge related to a proposed sale. Inside were maps, letters, and a plan Samuel had drawn years earlier. The plan was not legally binding. It was a wish. My grandfather had imagined using part of the land as a place where service members and their families could recover after long deployments, injury, or loss. Cabins near the river, trails through the woods, transportation for older veterans who could no longer drive, a workshop where people could repair equipment, build furniture, or simply work beside someone without being required to explain what hurt. At the bottom of the plan, he had written a note to me. Mara, if you are reading this, someone probably tried to turn the land into a price. Do not keep it untouched merely to prove them wrong. Make it useful. Let purpose be the answer. There was a second envelope. It was addressed to my father. Thomas opened it with a pocket knife. Samuel's letter acknowledged the years my father had spent caring for him and my grandmother. It said that service inside a family often goes unnoticed because there are no medals, no ceremonies, and no official record. Then my grandfather wrote something that changed the way my father carried the past. The land goes to Mara because she will defend its purpose. But if the day comes when she builds that purpose, she will need someone who understands timetables, people, and the dignity of arriving where you are expected. I hope she asks you. My father read the sentence twice. Evelyn looked at me. Samuel could be theatrical when he wanted, she said. My father folded the letter carefully. He did not ask for a role. That mattered. I asked whether he would help me design transportation and scheduling for the Veterans Center. He looked toward the tree line. I would be honored, he said. That was the warm twist my grandfather had left for both of us. He had not divided the land between us. He had divided the responsibility according to what each of us could carry. Over the next year, we created the Ellison River Project. We did not sell the core acreage. We placed much of it under a conservation agreement and negotiated a limited access easement with a regional utility. The payment funded the first phase without disturbing the ridge Meridian wanted to mine. We restored the stone house as a common lodge. We built 4 small cabins with wide doors, low thresholds, and porches facing the river. We partnered with veterans organizations, military family groups, and a hospital transportation network. My father designed the scheduling system. Of course he did. Every shuttle had a route card. Every guest arrival had a backup plan. Every driver received a printed folder, even though the younger staff insisted everything could live on a phone. Phones lose signal, my father said. Paper has never asked me to update a password. No one argued after that. Dottie volunteered in the library. Earl drove the first shuttle. Evelyn donated the conference table, where we had spread the evidence against Celeste. We placed it in the lodge meeting room, not as a symbol of the lawsuit, but as proof that an object can serve a better purpose after holding something painful. I retired from the Army the following autumn. At the ceremony, my father sat in the front row. He wore the same gray suit he had worn to court, altered to fit because he had lost weight. When the general spoke about my years of service, I looked at my father and thought about service without uniforms. Afterward, he handed me a small box. Inside was my grandfather's brass survey compass. I thought Celeste sold it, I said. She tried, he replied. Dottie bought it at the estate sale and waited until I was ready to ask about it. The compass did not point toward money. It did not point toward revenge. It pointed north, steady and indifferent to every story we had told ourselves. At the opening of the Ellison River Project, more than 200 people stood under a white tent near the lodge. Veterans arrived with canes, wheelchairs, service dogs, grandchildren, and spouses who had carried more than anyone could see. My father opened the program. He did not speak about Celeste. He did not speak about the lawsuit. He said that loneliness can make a person accept the wrong invitation, but community gives people better doors to walk through. Then he introduced me. I had prepared a speech about the trust, my grandfather, and the future of the land. When I reached the podium, I put the pages aside. I told the audience that I had spent my career accounting for machines, parts, time, and risk. I had believed readiness meant preventing failure through discipline. That was only part of it. Real readiness also means knowing who will come when something has already failed. My grandfather prepared documents. Evelyn preserved them. Daniel followed the evidence. Renee gave my father an independent voice. Dottie watched the house across the street. Earl confirmed a simple drive to a clinic. A county recorder paused when a deed did not make sense. No single person saved us. A chain of ordinary people did their jobs and told the truth. That was the legacy worth protecting. After the ceremony, my father and I walked to the river. He moved more slowly than he had when I was young. I matched my pace to his. He asked whether I ever regretted not taking Meridian's money. I said no. Then I admitted that I sometimes imagined what $52 million could have done. He nodded. Your grandfather would say imagining is free, he said. We stood beside the water. My father took the torn calendar page from his wallet, the one from the day he met Celeste. He had carried it for nearly 2 years. I asked why. Because shame wants me to either stare at it forever or throw it away and pretend it never happened, he said. I am trying to do neither. He folded the page again and placed it back. That was when I understood forgiveness differently. Forgiveness was not declaring the past harmless. It was refusing to let the past become the only honest thing about a person. Celeste had targeted my father. She had studied his loneliness, used his resentment, and nearly turned our family into a financial instrument. My father had also made choices. He ignored warnings. He lent his name to a claim before he understood it. He allowed pride to speak where love should have asked a question. The truth held all of that. It also held what came after. Sunday dinners, shuttle schedules, repaired wind chimes, a river lodge full of people who needed somewhere to arrive. I still live simply. My vehicle is newer now, mostly because my father refused to schedule me as a driver until I replaced the one with the failing transmission. I draw a military pension. I serve on the project board. I keep my grandfather's compass on my desk. The trust remains strong. Its value rises and falls on paper. That no longer impresses me. I have seen what people will do for a number they believe can rescue them. I have also seen what people can build when they stop asking what something is worth and start asking what it is for. My father is 76 now. Every January, he receives a new pocket calendar. On the first page, he writes the same line. Tell Mara the truth before she turns it into a wall chart. I tell him that is not funny. He says the staff disagrees. Sometimes, near sunset, we sit on the lodge porch while the wind moves through the trees my grandfather refused to sell. Veterans talk quietly inside. A shuttle arrives exactly on time because my father has checked the route 3 times. The wind chimes from my mother's house hang beside the door. Their sound carries over the river. When I hear them, I do not think about the forged deed first. I do not think about Celeste or Meridian or the courtroom. I think about my grandfather's letter. I think about my father's calendar. I think about the day a county recorder chose to make one careful phone call. And I think about how close we came to losing each other over land that was never meant to separate us. Money did change how people looked at us. My grandfather had warned me about that. What he did not tell me was that character changes how you look back. That was the inheritance I finally understood.